Alira's wrists were already bleeding when the cart stopped moving. She had been awake for hours, though she could not say how many. The rope binding her hands had cut into her skin somewhere in the darkness, somewhere between the moment two men dragged her from her bed and the moment she found herself lying on cold wooden planks, staring up at a sky she did not recognize. Her mouth was dry. Her heart had not slowed since the first hand closed over it to muffle her scream. She remembered the candle going out. She remembered Sabine's voice, calm and cold, saying, "Make sure no one hears her." She remembered Cora standing in the doorway, arms folded, watching without a single flicker of guilt on her face, as if she were watching a servant clear a table, rather than watching her own sister being taken. Alira had screamed her sister's names until her throat felt raw. Neither of them had answered. Now, the cart rattled to a halt, and rough hands pulled her upright. A burlap sack was yanked from her head, and the sudden light stung her eyes so badly that she flinched and turned away, gasping. "On your feet," a voice barked. "We don't have all day." She stumbled down from the cart, her legs unsteady beneath her, and looked around at a scene she could never have imagined belonging to. Vethra. She recognized the name from stories her old nurse used to whisper, tales meant to frighten children into obedience. The border city where kingdoms traded not just silk and spice, but people. The square was crowded, loud, and smelled of sweat, smoke, and fear. Wooden platforms stood at the center, and on each one, men and women stood in chains, heads down, waiting to be sold like cattle. Alira's stomach turned. She had grown up in a manor with marble floors and silver cutlery. She had never once imagined she would stand among people whose eyes had already given up hope. "Move," the trader said, shoving her toward the platform. "Please," she whispered, though she knew it was useless. "Please, there has been some mistake. My name is Alira Hartwell, my family." "Your family sold you," the man snapped, not even looking at her. "Sold you fair and clean, girl. Don't waste your breath on stories. Everyone here has a story." The words hit her harder than the rope ever had. Sold, not stolen. Not kidnapped by strangers who could be reasoned with, bargained with, escaped from. Sold. By her own sisters. By her own blood. She was pushed up onto the platform, and the chain around her wrists was hooked to a post. The crowd below murmured, some glancing at her with curiosity, others with the flat, calculating gaze of buyers assessing cattle. She kept her eyes down, refusing to let them see how badly she was shaking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her tears, though they burned behind her eyes regardless. A man near the front called out a price. Another topped it. Alira barely heard the numbers being shouted, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling like a song she wanted no part of. She thought instead of the manor, of the garden behind the kitchen where she used to sit with her mother before she passed, of the way Sabine used to braid her hair when they were children, before jealousy hardened into something uglier. She thought of how she had trusted them, how she had believed, foolishly, that blood meant something. A murmur rippled through the crowd, distracting her from her thoughts. People were turning, parting, bowing their heads. Alira lifted her gaze despite herself, curious what could silence a marketplace full of shouting men so quickly. A group of soldiers moved through the crowd, tall men in dark armor bearing the mark of a wolf's head on their chests. They walked with the discipline of men who had seen battle and survived it many times over. Behind them walked a figure who made even the loudest traders fall silent. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed simply in black, without the gold and jewels she expected of royalty. But there was nothing simple about the way he moved, nothing simple about the way the crowd seemed to shrink from him without him ever raising a hand. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and even from a distance, Alira could see that his eyes carried a color she had never seen on another person, a deep, molten gold, like a wolf's eyes caught in firelight. "The Alpha King," someone whispered nearby, Cale Draven himself. Alira had heard the name before, always spoken with fear. The ruler of the Wolf Kingdoms, a man who had crushed 3 rival packs in a single year, who was said to show mercy to no one, who ruled not through kindness, but through a reputation so fearsome that few dared test it. She had imagined a monster. What stood before her instead was a man who looked almost bored, scanning the platforms, with the detached interest of someone forced to attend an event he had no wish to be at, until his eyes reached her. Alira felt it before she understood it, A shift in the air, a stillness that fell over him the moment his gaze landed on her face. He stopped walking. His soldiers, trained to notice every movement of their king, stopped as well, exchanging confused glances. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening, something unreadable passing behind those gold eyes. Elira did not know whether to look away or hold his gaze, so she simply stood frozen, chained to a post, feeling more exposed than she ever had in her life. "That one," Cale said, his voice low, but carrying easily across the square. "How much for that one?" The auctioneer, sensing an opportunity too rare to waste, straightened immediately, his earlier weariness replaced by barely concealed excitement. "Your Majesty honors us." "The girl has fetched several offers already." "How much?" Cale repeated. And this time, there was an edge in his voice that made the auctioneer swallow whatever bargaining tactic he had planned. A number was named. Cale did not blink, did not hesitate, did not even glance at the coin pouch one of his men produced. "Done," he said. "Release her chains. Now." The crowd erupted into whispers. Elira heard fragments of confused conversation around her. The king never bought slaves. The king had never once in his reign shown interest in the market. Why would he want a nobody? Some broken girl with no name anyone recognized. She barely registered any of it. Her wrists were freed from the post, though the chain connecting them remained, and she was led down from the platform on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. As she passed close to him, close enough to see the faint scar along his jaw, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite the coldness of his expression, he studied her face as if searching for something. "What is your name?" he asked quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it. "Elira," she whispered. "Elira Hartwell." Something flickered in his eyes at her name, though she could not read what it meant. He said nothing more. He simply turned, and his soldiers formed a wall around her, guiding her toward a carriage that waited at the edge of the square, its wood dark and polished, bearing the same wolf crest as his soldiers' armor. She climbed inside because she had no choice, because chains still bound her wrists, because every instinct told her that resisting a king surrounded by armed soldiers would end far worse than obedience. But as the carriage door closed and the horses began to pull away from Vethra, she allowed herself, for the first time since she'd been dragged from her bed, to truly cry. She cried for her sisters, who had betrayed her without a flicker of hesitation. She cried for the home she would never see again. She cried because she did not know what waited for her at the end of this road, whether the king who had bought her would prove kinder than the market that sold her, or simply cruel in a different, quieter way. Across from her, Cale sat in silence, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, though he made no move to touch her, no move to comfort her, no move at all except to watch, as though she were something he could not quite believe was real. "You will not be harmed," he said finally, breaking the silence as the carriage rattled over uneven road. "Whatever you believe is waiting for you, put it out of your mind." Elira lifted her tear-streaked face and looked at him properly for the first time. This man the whole kingdom feared, this ruthless conqueror who had just spent a fortune to buy a broken, betrayed girl from a slave market without explanation. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. Cale's jaw tightened again, and for a moment she thought he would not answer at all. Then he looked away, out the small window at the passing countryside, his expression unreadable. "That," he said quietly, "is not a question I am ready to answer." The carriage rolled on into the gathering evening, carrying Elira further from everything she had ever known, toward a fortress she had only heard of in frightened whispers, beside a king whose reputation promised cruelty, but whose eyes, whenever they returned to her, seemed to promise something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for, something that frightened her almost as much as the chains still resting heavy on her wrists. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the creak of the carriage wheels and the distant call of night birds. Elira watched the world shift from open farmland to dense forest, the trees growing taller and darker, their branches knitting together overhead, until the last light of the sun vanished entirely. She had never traveled this far from home in her life. Everything about this journey felt like crossing into another world, one with different rules, different dangers, different kings. She stole glances at Cale throughout the ride, trying to understand the man who sat across from her. He did not fidget the way other men might. did not seem impatient or bored by the long silence between them. He simply watched the passing dark with the stillness of a predator at rest, alert even when he appeared calm. Twice she caught him looking at her instead of the window, and both times he did not look away when she noticed, only held her gaze until she was the one who broke it first, her cheeks warming despite the chill in the carriage. "You should eat something," he said eventually, producing a small parcel of bread and dried meat from a compartment beneath his seat. "It will be a long ride yet." "I'm not hungry," Elira lied, though her stomach betrayed her with a low growl the moment the words left her mouth. The faintest hint of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close to one. "Eat anyway," he said, setting the parcel beside her, rather than forcing it into her bound hands. "Stubbornness will not serve you well where we are going." She eyed the food warily, distrust warring with hunger, before finally reaching for it with her chained hands. The bread was simple but fresh, and she ate slowly, watching him from beneath lowered lashes as she did. He did not eat himself, seeming content to watch the forest slide past, though she noticed the tension in his shoulders never fully eased, as though some part of him remained braced for danger even here, in the safety of his own carriage, surrounded by his own men. "You're soldiers," she said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. They seemed surprised, at the market. "They were," Cale admitted. "I have never before purchased anyone." "Then why me?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought again he would refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, careful, as though he were choosing each word with great deliberation. "There are things about my kingdom, about my people, that you do not yet understand," he said. "Things I am not prepared to explain in the back of a moving carriage, to a woman who has had a very long and very difficult day. I ask only that you trust me a little longer, until we reach the fortress." "You ask a great deal of trust from a stranger who bought me like livestock," Elira said, before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone, bracing for anger. Instead, something almost like regret passed over his features. "You are right to be angry," he said quietly. "I do not blame you for it. But I promise you this. Whatever happens from here, you will not be treated as livestock in my house. You have my word, and I do not give it lightly." Elira studied him, searching for the lie she expected to find, the cruelty she had been warned about her entire life whenever his name was mentioned. She found none of it in his expression, only a strange, guarded sincerity that unsettled her more than outright cruelty would have. The carriage began to slow as the trees thinned, and through the window, Elira caught her first glimpse of the fortress that would become her new home. A massive structure of dark stone rising against the night sky, its towers lit with torches, its walls thick enough to withstand any siege. It looked less like a palace and more like a mountain that had been carved into something that could house men, ancient and immovable and utterly commanding. "Welcome," Cale said quietly, watching her reaction, "to Dravenhold." Elira said nothing, her eyes wide as the carriage passed through the massive gates, guards bowing their heads as their king returned. She did not know what waited for her within those walls, safety or a different kind of danger dressed in gentler clothing, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her old life had ended the moment her sisters chose gold over blood, and whatever came next, she would have to face it alone, in a kingdom of wolves, beside a king whose eyes had looked at her as though he already knew secrets about her that she herself did not yet understand. The carriage rolled to a stop within an inner courtyard, and before Elira could gather herself, the door opened, and Cale stepped out first, extending a hand to help her down. She hesitated only a moment before accepting it, his grip firm but careful, as though he were handling something fragile despite his obvious strength. The courtyard buzzed with quiet activity despite the late hour, servants moving between doorways, soldiers changing posts, the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer still ringing somewhere beyond the walls. Every eye that fell upon Elira held the same confusion she had seen in the market, the same unspoken question. Who is she, and why does the king care? A woman approached them, older, with silver threading through dark hair, and a face that held both kindness and sharp intelligence. She wore fine but simple clothing, and the way the other servants parted for her told Elira she held some position of authority within the household. "Your Majesty," the woman said, bowing her head, before turning her attention to Alira, studying her with an assessing gaze that missed nothing. Not the chains, not the tear stains, not the exhaustion written plainly across her face. "This is her?" "This is Alira," Cale said, and something in the way he said her name, careful and deliberate, made the woman's eyebrows rise slightly. "See that her chains are removed immediately, and that she is given a room near mine. Have Grace prepare a bath and proper clothing. She is not to be treated as a prisoner, Margaret. Am I understood?" "Understood, Your Majesty," Margaret said, though her curious gaze lingered on Alira a moment longer, before she gestured for her to follow. Alira glanced back once at Cale, who remained standing in the courtyard, watching her go, with an expression she could not decipher. Something between relief and worry, as though he had won a small victory, but feared the larger battle was only beginning. She had no way of knowing, as she followed Margaret through the torch-lit halls of Dravenhold, chains finally falling away from her raw wrists, that the king who had just bought her from a slave market carried a secret about her that would change the course of both their lives, a secret written not in words, but in an ancient mark hidden beneath the sleeve of her dress, one that neither of them yet knew she carried into these walls. For now, she only knew that she was exhausted, frightened, and further from home than she had ever imagined possible. But beneath the fear, something else had begun to stir, small and unfamiliar, the faintest flicker of safety, offered by a man the world called Ruthless, in a fortress that was about to become the last place she expected to find anything resembling hope. The bath Margaret drew for her that night was the first warm water Alira had felt against her skin, in what felt like a lifetime, though it had only been a single day since her sister's betrayal. She sat in the copper tub long after the water had begun to cool, staring at the raw red marks still visible on her wrists, trying to understand how everything she had known could unravel so completely, in the space of a single night. Grace, a young maid with a gentle voice and quick hands, helped her dress in a simple but well-made gown afterward, and guided her to a chamber that made Alira's breath catch in her throat. It was nothing like the modest room she had shared with her belongings back home. The bed alone was larger than her old bedroom, draped in soft furs, and a fire already crackled in the hearth, chasing away the chill of the stone walls. "This is my room?" she asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "The king's orders," Grace said simply, as if that explained everything, though it explained nothing at all to Alira, who still could not understand why a man with a reputation for ruthlessness would show such strange, careful kindness to a slave he had purchased on a whim. That night, long after Grace had left her alone and the fire had burned low, Alira lay awake, staring at the ceiling, turning the day's events over and over in her mind. She thought of Sabine's cold voice ordering her taken, of Cora's silent, unblinking betrayal, of the auction block and the chains, and the terror of not knowing what fate awaited her. And she thought of gold eyes finding hers across a crowded market square, of a king's voice promising she would not be harmed, of a promise given so carefully it almost sounded like it cost him something to say it. She did not trust him. She could not trust him. Not yet. Not after everything that had happened. But as sleep finally began to pull her under, exhaustion overwhelming even her fear, she found herself wondering, against every instinct telling her not to, what secret Cale Draven was keeping about her, and why, despite everything, some small and foolish part of her almost wanted to know. A scream tore through the corridor outside Alira's room just before dawn, jolting her upright in bed, heart pounding before she was even fully awake. She sat frozen for a moment, listening, unsure if she had dreamed it. Then came the sound of running feet, urgent voices, the clash of metal against stone somewhere deeper in the fortress. She scrambled out of bed, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and pressed herself against the wall beside her door, uncertain whether to hide or seek answers. The door burst open before she could decide. It was Grace, pale and breathless, her hands trembling as she gripped the doorframe. "You must stay inside," Grace said quickly. "Please, my lady, bar the door if you can. There has been an intrusion." "An intrusion? Here?" Alira's voice came out higher than she intended. "Is the king safe?" "I don't know," Grace admitted, already backing out of the room. "I only know I was told to warn you and no one else. Stay inside, please." The door shut, and Alira heard the distinct sound of a bolt sliding into place from the outside. She was, quite literally, being locked in for her own protection, in a fortress she had arrived at less than a full day ago, in a kingdom she barely understood. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to make sense of the chaos beyond it. She could hear men shouting orders, the distant clang of weapons, and beneath it all, a low, rolling sound that made the hair on her arms rise, something that was not quite a growl and not quite a roar, deep and resonant, shaking the very stones around her. Minutes passed like hours. Elira paced the length of her chamber, wringing her hands, torn between fear for her own safety and a strange, unexpected concern for the man who had bought her only the day before. She barely knew him. She owed him nothing, and yet the thought of something happening to him, of waking to find herself once again at the mercy of strangers who did not care whether she lived or drowned in her own uncertainty, filled her with a dread she did not fully understand. The sounds outside eventually softened, then stopped altogether. Silence stretched so long that Elira began to wonder if she had imagined the entire ordeal, until finally she heard footsteps approaching her door, slower now, measured. The bolt slid free, and the door opened to reveal Cale himself, his shirt torn at the shoulder, a thin line of blood tracing down his forearm, though he seemed entirely unbothered by the injury. "You're hurt," Elira said before she could stop herself, stepping forward without thinking. "It's nothing," Cale said, though his eyes softened at her reaction, something flickering behind them that looked almost like surprise. "I came to make sure you were unharmed." "What happened?" she asked. Grace said there was an intrusion. Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would give her the same evasive answer he had offered in the carriage. Instead, he stepped further into the room, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "An assassin," he said. "Sent by a rival house that has long wished to see me removed from power. It is not the first attempt on my life, and it will likely not be the last. My men caught him before he reached my chambers." "They were trying to kill you," Elira said, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. "And you came here first, to check on me, before tending to your own wound?" Something unreadable crossed his face. "Yes," he said simply, offering no further explanation, as though the answer were obvious, even though it was anything but. Elira did not know what to say to that. She studied him in the dim morning light filtering through her window, this powerful, feared king, who had interrupted the aftermath of an attempt on his own life to make certain a slave girl he had known for less than a day was safe. Nothing about him matched the stories she had grown up hearing. "You should let someone tend to that wound properly," she said finally, nodding toward his arm. "I will," Cale said, though he made no move to leave. He studied her instead, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin warm, despite the early hour, despite the chaos of the night. "Elira, I must ask something of you, and I need you to trust that I have good reason for asking." "What is it?" "For the time being, I would ask that you not wander the fortress alone, and that you allow one of my guards to remain near you at all times." "Not as your captor," he added quickly, seeing the flash of alarm in her eyes, "but as your protection. Until I understand fully who sent that assassin, and why, I cannot guarantee your safety otherwise." "Why would an assassin sent to kill you have any interest in me?" Elira asked, confusion knitting her brow. "I am no one of importance. I was a slave on an auction block yesterday." Cale was quiet for a long moment, and Elira watched something war behind his eyes, the desire to tell her something, and the caution holding him back. "There are things I still need to confirm," he said finally, his voice careful. "Things I do not wish to burden you with until I am certain. I promise you, Elira, the moment I know for certain, you will be the first to hear it from me. Until then, please, allow me to keep you safe." It was not an answer. It was, if anything, more evasive than his response in the carriage the night before. And yet something in the earnestness of his expression, in the exhaustion visible beneath his composed exterior, made her nod, despite her lingering questions. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll allow the guard." Relief passed visibly through him, his shoulders loosening slightly. "Thank you," he said, and then, as though remembering himself, straightened and took a step back toward the door. "Rest if you can. I will have Grace bring breakfast shortly." He left before she could ask any more questions, and Alira stood alone in her chamber once more, staring at the door, turning over everything he had said, and everything he had carefully avoided saying. An assassin sent for the king, and yet Cale's first thought had been for her safety, his manner suggesting the two events were somehow connected, in a way he was not yet ready to explain. She spent the following days in a strange, unsettled peace. True to his word, Cale assigned a guard to remain near her at all times, a quiet, watchful young man named Edmund, who spoke little, but seemed to take his duty seriously, never straying more than a few paces from her side whenever she left her chamber. She was given free rein to explore much of the fortress under his watch, and slowly, cautiously, she began to piece together fragments of the world she had been thrust into. She learned, through careful conversation with Grace and the other servants, that the wolf kingdoms were ruled by families who carried an ancient bloodline, one that gave certain among them abilities beyond those of ordinary men. Strength, speed, senses sharper than any human's. Cale, they whispered, was among the most powerful of his line in generations, which was part of why his enemies feared him, and part of why so many sought to see him removed. She learned that Dravenhold had stood for centuries, weathering wars and sieges that would have crumbled lesser fortresses. She learned that the servants both feared and respected their king in equal measure, describing him as fair but unyielding, generous to those loyal to him, but merciless to those who betrayed his trust. And she learned, though no one spoke of it directly, that something about her presence within these walls had unsettled the entire household, in a way they did not fully understand themselves. It was nearly a week after her arrival, when the strangeness came to a head. Alira had been walking through the fortress gardens, with Edmund trailing a respectful distance behind her, enjoying a rare moment of quiet among the rose bushes that reminded her faintly of the garden back home, when she heard raised voices near the training yard beyond the garden wall. Curiosity getting the better of her, she moved closer, peering through a gap in the hedge to see Cale standing amid a group of his most senior soldiers, all of them arguing in low, urgent tones. "You cannot keep this from the council forever," one of the older soldiers was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "If she truly carries the mark, they will demand she be presented. You know this, Cale." "She has been in my house for 6 days," Cale snapped back, and Alira had never heard him speak with such raw agitation before. 6 days, Garrick. She has only just stopped flinching every time a door closes too loudly. I will not drag her before the council to be studied like some prize before she has even had time to understand what has happened to her life. And if the council learns of it another way? If your enemies learn of it first, Garrick pressed. You saw what happened with the assassin. That was no random attack, and you know it. Word is already spreading that the king bought a slave girl at Vethra and has kept her close ever since. It will not take long for someone to guess why. Alira's breath caught in her throat. The mark. What mark? What were they speaking of? She pressed closer to the hedge, straining to hear more, her heart hammering against her ribs. I am aware of the danger, Cale said, his voice lower now, though still carrying enough for her to hear. Which is precisely why I intend to tell her myself, in my own time, in a way that does not terrify her further. She has already lost everything once, Garrick. I will not have her learn the truth of what she is, from frightened whispers, or a room full of strangers demanding proof. And when do you intend for this own time to arrive? Garrick asked, though his tone had softened slightly. Cale was quiet for a long moment. Soon, he said finally. Before the harvest gathering, at the very latest. I owe her that much. Alira stepped back from the hedge slowly, her mind racing, her earlier curiosity replaced by something closer to dread. A mark. Something about her that could put her in danger. Something serious enough that Cale's own soldiers were pressing him to reveal it, before enemies discovered it first. She thought of the assassin, of Cale's insistence that she remain guarded at all times, of the strange, careful way he had looked at her since the very first moment their eyes met across the slave market. Whatever secret he was keeping, it was larger than she had imagined, and far more dangerous than she had allowed herself to believe. That night, unable to sleep, Alira sat by her window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard below, turning over the fragments of conversation she had overheard. She thought of pressing Cale directly, of demanding answers, rather than waiting for whatever careful, gentle moment he was planning to choose for her. But something held her back, not fear of his anger, she realized with some surprise, but a strange, reluctant trust that he truly meant to tell her when he believed she was ready, that his caution came not from cruelty, but from something that almost resembled care. It was a strange thing, to find herself trusting a man the world called ruthless more than she had ever trusted her own sisters. She did not know, as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, that the harvest gathering Garrick had spoken of was mere weeks away, and that whatever secret Cale Draven had been guarding since the moment he laid eyes on her in that crowded slave market would soon come to light in a way neither of them could fully control, a revelation that would change not only how she understood herself, but how the entire kingdom would come to see her, for better and for far, far worse. The scream that pulled Elira from sleep this time was her own. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her like cold water. Chains, her sister's laughing faces, a hand reaching for her that she could not identify. Her heart pounded so violently she pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could physically hold it still. It took several long moments before she remembered where she was, before the dark shapes of her chamber resolved into familiar furniture, rather than the shadows of her nightmare. A soft knock came at her door almost immediately. "My lady?" Edmund's voice, low and careful. "Are you well?" "I'm fine," she called back, her voice shaking, despite her best efforts to steady it. "A bad dream. Nothing more." She heard him hesitate outside the door, before finally retreating to his post, and Elira sat alone in the darkness, knees drawn to her chest, waiting for her pulse to slow. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at Dravenhold. 3 weeks of overheard fragments and careful silences, of Cale watching her with an expression that suggested he was perpetually on the verge of a conversation he could not quite bring himself to start. She had not confronted him about what she'd overheard in the garden. Some part of her clung to the strange comfort of not knowing, as if ignorance might delay whatever storm was building on the horizon. But the dreams had grown worse in recent nights, and she suspected, though she could not explain why, that they were somehow tied to the secret he continued to withhold. The harvest gathering was in 3 days. Elira rose the next morning heavy with exhaustion, and Grace, ever perceptive, noticed immediately as she helped her dress. "You look as though you haven't slept at all," Grace observed gently, fastening the ties of Elira's gown. "I haven't, not really," Elira admitted. "Grace, may I ask you something?" "Of course, my lady." "Do you know anything about a mark? Something the king's men were speaking of. A mark someone might carry, one important enough to bring danger with it." Grace's hands stilled for just a fraction of a second before continuing their work, but Elira caught it, the small hesitation, confirming that Grace knew more than she was willing to say. "That is not my place to speak of, my lady," Grace said carefully. "The king should be the one to tell you, if he wishes it told." "So there is something," Elira pressed, "something about me." Grace's eyes met hers in the mirror, sympathy and reluctance warring in her expression. "Please, my lady, give him a little more time. He is trying to protect you, in his own way. I have served this house for many years, and I have never once seen him this careful with anyone." Elira wanted to press further, but the genuine plea in Grace's voice stopped her. She nodded instead, though frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. She was tired of being protected by silence. She was tired of everyone around her knowing more about her own fate than she did. That afternoon, she decided she would wait no longer. She found Cale in his study, bent over a table covered in maps and correspondence, a furrow etched deep between his brows. He looked up as she entered, and something in her expression must have alerted him immediately, because he straightened at once, setting down the quill he'd been holding. "Elira, is something wrong?" "Tell me," she said simply, closing the door behind her. "Whatever it is you've been keeping from me. I overheard you speaking with Garrick, weeks ago, in the garden. A mark. Something about me that has your men worried. Something dangerous enough that assassins might be sent because of it. I have waited patiently, Cale, because Grace asked me to give you time, but I cannot bear the not knowing any longer. Please, tell me the truth." Cale was silent for a long moment, and she watched the internal struggle play out across his face, the same struggle she had witnessed in the garden weeks earlier, careful and reluctant. Finally, he exhaled slowly and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said quietly. "Please." She sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, bracing herself for whatever truth he was finally prepared to share. "Among my people," Cale began, choosing his words with obvious care. "There exists a bond spoken of in the oldest histories, one that appears perhaps once in a generation, sometimes less. It is called the fated bond. When it occurs, the two people connected by it carry a mark, small, often hidden, appearing somewhere on the body, without explanation. For those who carry royal blood among the wolf kingdoms, this bond is believed to signify more than mere connection. It is believed to signify destiny itself, two souls bound together by forces older than any kingdom, any crown." Alira's breath caught, understanding beginning to dawn even before he finished speaking, though she could not yet believe what her mind was suggesting. "And you believe," she said slowly, "that I carry this mark." Cale reached across the desk, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. When she did not, he gently turned her wrist, the one that had once been raw and bleeding from the rope that bound her at the market, now healed but for a faint discoloration she had noticed weeks ago, and assumed was simply a bruise that refused to fade. "This," he said quietly, his thumb brushing lightly over the mark, a small, intricate pattern that resembled, now that she looked closely, the shape of interlocking crescents. "This is the mark. I saw it the moment I looked at you across that market square, before you had even stepped down from the platform. I knew what it meant before I understood why fate had chosen to reveal it to me in a slave market of all places." "You bought me," Alira said slowly, pulling the pieces together, "not out of pity or curiosity. You bought me because you recognized this mark, because you believed I was your fated mate." "Yes," Cale admitted, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something like vulnerability cross his features, the ruthless king stripped bare of his composure. "I could not leave you there, Alira. Not when I understood what you were, what you carried. Fated mates who go unclaimed, unprotected, become targets. For rival kingdoms who wish to weaken the bloodline they belong to. For those who believe capturing or harming a mate can somehow disrupt the fate itself. I could not risk what might happen to you if I walked away and left you to be purchased by someone else, or worse, left unclaimed entirely for others to discover. That is why the assassin came," Alira said, the final piece falling into place. "Someone learned or suspected what I was." "Yes," Cale said grimly. "And it is why I have kept you guarded so closely, why I asked Garrick and the others to keep this quiet as long as possible. I wanted you to have time, Alira. Time to heal from what your sisters did to you. Time to understand this world before it was thrust upon you all at once. I am sorry that circumstance did not allow for as much time as I wished to give you." Alira sat in stunned silence, absorbing everything he had told her, feeling the weight of it settle over her like a physical thing. A fated mate. Destiny bound to a king she had known for less than a month, a man whose reputation had terrified her before she'd ever laid eyes on him. A man who had proven, in every private moment since, to be nothing like the stories claimed. "What does this mean?" she asked quietly. "For me? For my life now?" "It means," Cale said, his voice softening in a way that made something in her chest ache, "that I intend to protect you with everything I have, for as long as I live, regardless of whether you ever choose to accept what fate has offered us. The bond does not demand anything of you, Alira. It does not obligate you to feel anything toward me that you do not choose to feel, but it does mean that I am bound, by something older than my own will, to keep you safe. And even without the bond, I believe I would choose to do the same." "Even without it?" she asked, searching his face. "Even without it," he confirmed, holding her gaze steadily. "I do not know what this bond truly asks of either of us yet, Alira. I only know that from the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you, and I have not been able to look away since. I will not pretend that frightens me less than it seems to frighten you." The honesty in his voice disarmed her more than any grand declaration could have. She had expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the revelation of a mystical bond would come wrapped in overwhelming certainty, in sweeping proclamations of destiny and devotion. Instead, she found a man as uncertain and cautious as she was, feeling his way through something neither of them fully understood, offering honesty instead of empty promises. "The harvest gathering," she said finally, remembering the deadline Garrick had mentioned in the garden weeks ago. "You said you needed to tell me before then." "The council will be present," Cale explained, representatives from every allied house within the Wolf Kingdoms. If they learn of the mark independently, without my having presented the truth myself, it could be seen as an attempt at deception, which would damage trust I have spent years building. I intend to present you formally at the gathering, Alira, as the one fate has marked for me. It is customary, though I understand if the thought of standing before so many strangers frightens you. It does, Alira admitted honestly, but I would rather stand beside truth than hide from it. I have had enough of hiding, and enough of others deciding my fate without my knowledge. If this is happening, I want to face it with my eyes open. Something like pride flickered across Kale's expression, quickly followed by something warmer, something that made her pulse quicken despite everything churning through her mind. You are remarkable, he said quietly. Do you know that? After everything that has been done to you, after everything I have just placed upon your shoulders, and still you choose to face it rather than run from it. I am tired of running, Alira said simply, or being made to run by others. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment afterward, the weight of the revelation settling between them not as a burden, but as something shared, something that bound them together in a way that felt, for the first time since her arrival, less frightening, and more like the beginning of an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. Over the following 3 days, preparations for the harvest gathering consumed the fortress. Alira found herself swept into fittings for formal attire, lessons on court etiquette from Margaret, whose sharp exterior gradually revealed a genuine warmth as she took Alira's education seriously, determined that no council member would find fault in her bearing. You carry yourself well, Margaret told her during one such lesson, studying Alira as she practiced the careful bow expected before the council. Better than I expected, given the circumstances of your arrival. I was raised in a noble house, Alira said quietly. Before everything changed, I know how to conduct myself among people who judge harshly. Something sympathetic passed over Margaret's features. Your sisters, she said carefully, the ones who sold you. Do you think of them often? Alira considered the question honestly before answering. Less than I expected to, she admitted. I think I am still angry, but I am also, strangely, grateful, not for what they did, but for where it has led me. I do not know if that makes sense. It makes a great deal of sense, Margaret said. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us clear a path toward something we would never have found otherwise. That does not excuse the cruelty, but it does not have to erase the possibility of something good growing from the wreckage either. Alira turned the words over in her mind long after the lesson ended, finding unexpected comfort in them, as the day of the gathering finally arrived, bringing with it a truth that the entire kingdom was about to learn. A truth that would either secure her place at Kale's side, or mark her, quite literally, as a target for every enemy who wished to see the Alpha King's power broken before it could ever fully take root. The great hall of Dravenhold had never looked so crowded, or so tense. Alira stood just beyond the tall double doors, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling, listening to the low roar of dozens of conversations happening at once within the hall. Representatives from every allied house of the Wolf Kingdoms had gathered for the harvest ceremony, filling the space with silk and steel, ambition and suspicion in equal measure. You look ready to bolt, Margaret observed beside her, adjusting the fall of Alira's deep blue gown one final time. Breathe, child, you have prepared for this. Preparing to walk into a room and be introduced as the king's fated mate is not something a few days of etiquette lessons can fully prepare a person for, Alira said, only half joking. No, Margaret agreed with a small, knowing smile. But you are stronger than you believe yourself to be. I have watched you these past weeks. You do not break easily. Before Alira could respond, the doors began to open, and the low roar of conversation within the hall gradually quieted as those nearest the entrance noticed movement. Alira's heart climbed into her throat as she caught sight of Kale, standing at the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais, dressed in formal dark robes, trimmed with silver, that made him look every inch the powerful ruler his reputation described. His eyes found hers immediately across the crowded room, and something in his expression steadied her more than any words could have. She walked the length of the hall with her chin lifted, refusing to let the weight of dozens of curious, calculating stares bow her posture. Whispers followed her every step, some curious, some openly hostile, a few laced with something closer to disbelief. A slave, she heard someone murmur as she passed. The king's fated mate, purchased at a market like common cattle. She did not let the words touch her, though they stung more than she wanted to admit. She had expected judgment. She had not fully prepared for how personal it would feel, standing alone before a hall full of strangers who had already decided, before knowing anything true about her, that she was unworthy of the position destiny had placed her in. Cale descended the dais to meet her halfway, extending his hand. She took it, grateful for the steadiness of his grip, and together, they climbed the remaining steps to stand before the assembled council. "Members of the council," Cale began, his voice carrying easily through the now silent hall, commanding attention without effort. "3 weeks ago, I discovered what many of you have already begun to suspect through rumor and speculation. I present to you Alira Hartwell, marked by fate as bound to me, in accordance with the oldest traditions of our bloodline." He extended her arm gently, revealing the mark on her wrist to the assembled crowd. A ripple of murmurs swept through the hall, some in surprised acknowledgement, others in open skepticism. "Forgive my bluntness, Your Majesty," an older man near the front spoke up, his voice carrying an edge of challenge. "But marks can be forged. Claims can be fabricated. How are we to know this is a genuine fated bond, and not merely convenient timing for a king who has long resisted the pressure to name an heir?" A tense silence fell over the hall. Alira felt Cale's grip tighten slightly around her hand, though his expression remained composed, controlled. "I understand your skepticism, Lord Aldrich," Cale said evenly. "It is a fair question, and I would expect no less from this council. I would remind you, however, that the fated bond has never once, in recorded history, been successfully forged. The mark responds to proximity between true mates, growing more vivid the longer the bond remains close and unbroken. If any among you doubt its authenticity, I invite you to examine it yourselves, and to note its clarity." An uncomfortable silence stretched through the hall as several council members exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge to their doubts. Lord Aldrich's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, apparently unwilling to press the matter without stronger evidence to support his skepticism. It was then that another voice cut through the tension, cold and familiar, in a way that made Alira's blood run cold, before she even turned to identify its source. "How touching," the voice said, dripping with false sweetness. "My own sister, elevated from slave to queen in the span of a single month. Fate does move in mysterious ways." Alira's head snapped toward the sound, and her stomach dropped as she recognized the figure making her way through the parting crowd, dressed in fine silks that had clearly been purchased with money that was never rightfully hers to spend. Sabine. Beside her, equally composed and equally unwelcome, walked Cora, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling concern, though Alira knew better than to trust it. "What are you doing here?" Alira demanded, shock overriding whatever careful composure she had maintained throughout the ceremony. "We heard rumors," Sabine said smoothly, ignoring the hostility in Alira's voice entirely, "of a slave girl elevated to the king's side. We could hardly believe it was truly our own dear sister. We came at once, out of concern for your well-being, of course." "Concern," Alira repeated, disbelief and fury warring within her. "You sold me. You had me dragged from my bed in the middle of the night and sold to slave traders, and now you dare stand here and speak of concern?" A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled council, several members turning sharply toward Sabine and Cora, their earlier skepticism about Alira's authenticity forgotten in the face of this new, far more damning revelation. Sabine's composure flickered, just barely, before she recovered. "A misunderstanding," she said quickly, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Our family faced difficult circumstances. Choices were made in desperation, choices I have long regretted." "Do not," Cale's voice cut through the hall like a blade, cold and absolute, in a way Alira had not heard from him before. "Insult everyone present by attempting to disguise a betrayal as desperation. I have heard the full account of what was done to Alira. There was no misunderstanding. There was cruelty, calculated and deliberate, carried out by two women who valued gold above the sister who trusted them." Sabine's face paled, and beside her, Cora's carefully composed mask finally cracked, revealing something closer to panic beneath it. "Your Majesty," Cora said quickly, Surely you understand that family disputes can become complicated. We only wish to reconcile with our sister, now that we see how fortune has favored her." "Fortune had nothing to do with it," Kale said coldly. "Illyra survived what you did to her through her own strength, not through any kindness the two of you have shown. You will not use this gathering, or my hospitality, to rewrite the truth of your actions." The hall had gone utterly silent now, every council member watching the confrontation unfold with rapt, uncomfortable attention. Illyra felt something shift within her chest, watching her sisters squirm before the very people whose respect they had clearly hoped to win through association with her newfound position. "I have nothing to say to either of you," Illyra said finally, her voice steadier than she expected, carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You made your choice the night you had me dragged from my bed. I have made mine. Standing here today, there is nothing between us left to reconcile." For a moment, something almost like genuine hurt flickered across Sabine's face, quickly smothered by wounded pride. "You would turn your back on your own blood," she said, "for a man you have known less than a month?" "I would turn my back," Illyra corrected, "on the family that turned their back on me first. Blood did not protect me when I needed it most. This man did, without hesitation, without asking anything of me in return." Kale's hand tightened around hers again, though this time in something closer to quiet support than the earlier tension of the confrontation. "Guards," he said, his voice returning to the cold authority he had used earlier. "Escort these two from my hall, and from my lands. They are no longer welcome within the borders of Dravenhold, nor within any territory allied to my crown." Sabine opened her mouth as if to protest, but the guards were already moving to ever, closing in around both sisters with a firmness that left no room for further argument. As they were led away, Cora cast one final glance back at Illyra, something unreadable in her expression. Regret, perhaps, or simply the realization that whatever power they had once held over their youngest sister was now permanently, irrevocably broken. The hall remained silent for a long moment after the doors closed behind them, the entire assembly absorbing what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, Lord Aldrich stepped forward once more, his earlier skepticism entirely replaced by something closer to respect. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing his head, "and Lady Illyra, I withdraw my earlier doubts. Whatever fate has decided, it seems it has chosen well." One by one, the assembled council members began to bow, a wave of acknowledgement spreading through the hall that left Illyra momentarily breathless with the enormity of it. Weeks ago, she had stood chained on an auction block, sold by her own family for nothing more than the debts they owed. Now she stood before the most powerful council in the Wolf Kingdoms, watching them bow their heads in recognition of a position she had never sought, never expected, and was only beginning to understand. Later that night, after the formal ceremony had concluded and the hall had emptied of its curious, calculating guests, Illyra found herself standing on a balcony overlooking the fortress grounds, the cool night air a welcome relief after the tension of the day. Kale joined her quietly, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, though he made no move to touch her. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace today," he said quietly. "Facing your sisters before the entire council could not have been easy." "It was easier than I expected," Illyra admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I think some part of me needed to see them again, needed to say those words aloud, in front of witnesses. It felt like closing a door I had been standing halfway through for weeks." "And now that the door is closed?" Illyra considered the question carefully before answering, watching the moonlight play across the fortress grounds below. "Now," she said slowly, "I find myself wondering what waits on this side of it. What kind of life I might build here, in a place I never imagined belonging to, beside a man the world fears but who has shown me nothing but care since the moment we met." Kale turned to face her fully then, his gold eyes catching the moonlight in a way that made her breath catch. "I cannot promise you an easy life, Illyra," he said quietly. "The mark that binds us will bring danger as often as it brings anything else. Today's confrontation with your sisters was difficult, but it was nothing compared to the enemies who will seek to use you against me, now that the truth has been revealed to the entire council. Word will spread quickly. Every rival kingdom will soon know that I have found my fated mate, and every rival kingdom will understand precisely what that means for their own ambitions. You told me once you would protect me with everything you have, Illyra said, remembering his words in his study weeks earlier. Does that promise still hold, even knowing how much more dangerous my presence here has now become? It holds more firmly now than it did then, Cale said without hesitation, something fierce and unwavering in his voice. I did not fully understand, that day in the market, what I was choosing to protect. I understand it now. And I will not fail you, Illyra, whatever comes. The certainty in his voice settled something within her that had remained unsteady since the night her sisters had her dragged from her bed. For the first time since that betrayal, standing on a moonlit balcony beside a king whose reputation for ruthlessness had somehow, impossibly, transformed into a foundation of fierce and unwavering protection, Illyra allowed herself to believe, just a little, that whatever storm was coming, she would not have to weather it alone. She did not yet know how soon that storm would arrive, or how violently it would test the promise Cale had just made her. But standing there in the quiet aftermath of the harvest gathering, with the mark on her wrist warm beneath her sleeve, and the man fate had chosen for her standing steady at her side, Illyra felt something she had not felt in weeks. She felt, for the first time since the night of her betrayal, something close to safe. The arrow came out of nowhere, splitting the air where Illyra's head had been only a heartbeat before. She barely had time to register the sound, a sharp whistling hiss, before Edmund's arm slammed across her chest, driving her down behind an overturned garden bench. The second arrow struck the stone path where she had been standing, its impact sending chips of rock scattering across the grass. Stay down, Edmund hissed, his sword already drawn, his eyes scanning the tree line beyond the garden wall with fierce concentration. My lady, do not move from this spot. Illyra's heart pounded so violently she could hear it in her ears, drowning out even the sound of shouting that had erupted elsewhere in the garden as more guards converged on their position. 2 months had passed since the harvest gathering, 2 months of relative peace that had allowed her to believe, foolishly perhaps, that the worst of the danger might have passed. She understood now how wrong that belief had been. More arrows followed, 3, then 4, each one aimed with a precision that left no doubt this was no random attack. Someone had studied her movements, knew her habits well enough to predict exactly where she would be walking through the garden at this hour. Edmund returned fire with a small crossbow he carried, and somewhere beyond the wall, she heard a pained cry, followed by the crash of someone fleeing through the underbrush. Then, suddenly, Cale was there, moving with a speed that seemed almost impossible for a man his size, vaulting over the garden wall in a single fluid motion that left Illyra staring in disbelief, despite the danger still surrounding them. His eyes had shifted, she realized with a start, the gold of them burning brighter, more intense, and there was something different about the way he moved now. Faster, more predatory, every motion controlled and lethal. He disappeared into the tree line after the fleeing attackers, and for several long, terrifying minutes, Illyra crouched behind the overturned bench, with Edmund standing guard beside her, listening to the sounds of pursuit fading into the distance beyond the garden wall. When Cale finally returned, his shirt was torn, and there was blood on his hands, that Illyra could not immediately tell whether it belonged to him or to whoever he had pursued. His eyes found hers instantly, scanning her from head to toe with a desperation that made her chest ache. Are you hurt? He demanded, crossing the distance between them in seconds, kneeling before her and taking her face gently between his hands, as though needing physical confirmation that she was truly unharmed. I'm fine, Illyra managed, though her voice shook. Edmund pulled me down in time. Cale, your hands. Not my blood, he said quickly, though the tightness in his jaw suggested the confrontation had not been without cost. The archer got away, but 2 others did not. We will learn who sent them. Illyra allowed herself to be pulled into his arms, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the adrenaline of the attack slowly draining away, leaving behind only the trembling aftermath of fear. She could feel his heart pounding as fiercely as her own, and understanding, dawned slowly, that his fear had matched hers entirely, perhaps exceeded it. This is the 3rd attempt in 2 months, Cale said finally, his voice low and controlled in a way that Illyra recognized now as barely contained fury. The first 2 were subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence, but this... He shook his head, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. This was not subtle. Whoever is behind this has grown bold, or desperate, or both. Do you know who it is? Elira asked. I suspect, Cale said grimly, but suspicion is not proof, and I will not act rashly against a rival house without certainty. It would only give them cause to claim persecution, to rally other houses to their defense. He helped her to her feet, his arm remaining protectively around her shoulders, even as guards began arriving in greater numbers, securing the garden and the surrounding grounds. Come. We should not remain out in the open. That evening, Cale called an emergency council of his most trusted advisors, and Elira, no longer content to be shielded entirely from the discussions that concerned her own safety, insisted on being present, despite Cale's initial reluctance. I would rather understand the danger I face than be kept ignorant of it, she told him firmly, when he attempted to suggest she remain in her chamber while the council met. I have had enough of others deciding what I should or should not know, Cale. Please, let me be part of this. Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded, though the worry in his eyes did not fully fade. Very well, he said, but you will remain close to me throughout. The council gathered in the same study where Cale had first revealed the truth of the fated bond, to her months earlier, though the atmosphere now was far more tense, far more urgent. Garrick stood near the window, his expression grim, while several other senior officers Elira recognized from the harvest gathering filled the remaining chairs around the table. The two attackers we captured have been questioned, Garrick began without preamble. Both were mercenaries, hired through intermediaries, which unfortunately makes tracing the true source more difficult. However, one detail has emerged that I believe confirms our earlier suspicions. Go on, Cale said tightly. The payment they received, Garrick continued, was made in coin, bearing the mint mark of House Voss. A heavy silence fell over the room. Elira watched confusion and understanding war across the faces of the assembled officers, though clearly the name carried weight she did not yet fully understand. House Voss, Cale repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Lord Aldrich's rival house, the one that has long contested my claim to the Northern Territories. The very same, Garrick confirmed. It appears Lord Voss has decided that eliminating your fated mate would achieve two objectives simultaneously, weakening your standing among the council by disrupting the bond that has strengthened your position, while also destabilizing your claim to the Northern Territories by removing what he perceives as a symbol of your growing power. He believes harming me will weaken Cale, Elira said slowly, working through the logic even as the words left her mouth. Not simply out of grief, but because the bond itself is tied to his authority somehow. The old texts suggest as much, one of the other officers offered. A broken fated bond, particularly one broken through violence, is believed among our people to weaken the standing of the surviving mate considerably, both in the eyes of the council, and, some believe, in actual strength and vitality. Whether the old texts are entirely accurate is debatable, but Lord Voss clearly believes them enough to act on the theory. Elira felt sick at the thought, the calculated cruelty of a man willing to use her as a tool to weaken someone else's power, treating her life as nothing more than a strategic piece, to be removed from play. It was a horror uncomfortably similar to what her own sisters had done, though on a far larger, more dangerous scale. What do we do? She asked, looking to Cale. We cannot move against Lord Voss without proof strong enough to withstand challenge before the full council, Cale said, his jaw tight with barely restrained frustration. Hired mercenaries and mint marks, while suggestive, are not conclusive. Lord Voss will claim, rightly, that coin can be stolen or planted to implicate him falsely. Then he will simply try again, Elira said, the reality of the situation settling over her like a physical weight. And again, until either he succeeds, or until you find proof strong enough to move against him. Not if we can help it, Cale said firmly. Garrick, I want additional guards posted throughout the fortress and grounds, doubled patrols along every approach to Draven Hold, and I want eyes on Lord Voss's movements, discreetly. If he is behind this, he will grow careless eventually. Overconfident men always do. The council continued discussing logistics and security measures long into the evening, and Elira found herself grateful, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, to finally understand the shape of the danger she faced, rather than simply feeling its effects without comprehension. Knowledge, she realized, however frightening, was infinitely preferable to the helpless uncertainty she had lived with for weeks. Later that night, long after the council had dispersed and the fortress had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Illyra found Cale standing alone on the same balcony where they had spoken after the harvest gathering months earlier. He did not turn as she approached, though she knew, from the slight shift in his shoulders, that he was aware of her presence. "You should be resting," he said quietly, though there was no real reproach in his voice. "So should you," she countered, coming to stand beside him. "You have not slept properly in days, Cale. I can see it in your eyes." "I cannot rest," he admitted, "knowing that every moment I close my eyes is a moment someone might slip past our defenses and reach you. I know it is not rational. My men are skilled. The fortress is secure. But the thought of losing you—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening, and looked away toward the dark tree line beyond the fortress walls. "You will not lose me," Illyra said softly, though she understood the promise was easier spoken than guaranteed. "I refuse to be so easily removed from a life I have only just begun to build here." Something almost like a smile touched Cale's lips, though it did not fully banish the worry etched into his features. "You have grown fierce," he observed, "since the day I found you in that market. I do not think the woman who stood trembling on that auction block would recognize the woman standing beside me now." "I think," Illyra said slowly, considering the truth of his words, "that woman is still there, somewhere beneath everything that has happened since. But she has learned that fear does not have to mean weakness. I watched what happened to me when I let others decide my fate entirely. My sisters, the slave traders, even circumstance itself. I do not intend to be so passive again, not when I finally have some measure of choice in how I face what comes." Cale turned to face her fully then, his gold eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I meant what I told you months ago," he said quietly. "I will protect you with everything I have, but I begin to think, watching you these past months, that you may need my protection far less than I once believed." "Perhaps," Illyra said, allowing herself a small smile despite the tension still coiled within her. "That seems a fairer arrangement than one of us carrying the weight alone." "A fairer arrangement indeed," Cale agreed, reaching for her hand and lacing his fingers through hers, the mark on her wrist warm against his palm. "Whatever comes, Illyra, we face it together. I promise you that, if nothing else." Standing together on the balcony, beneath a sky scattered with stars, with danger circling closer with each passing week, and an enemy growing bolder in his attempts to tear them apart, Illyra found herself holding tightly to that promise, understanding that the true test of everything they had built together was still, unmistakably, yet to come. The letter arrived without warning, sealed with wax that bore no house crest, slipped beneath Illyra's door sometime in the early hours of the morning, when even Edmund, stationed faithfully outside her chamber, had noticed nothing unusual. She found it when she woke, lying innocently on the floor near the threshold, and something about its plainness, its deliberate anonymity, made her stomach tighten with unease, even before she broke the seal. The handwriting inside was unmistakably Sabine's, elegant and precise, despite the desperation bleeding through every line. "Illyra, I know I have no right to write to you, and I know you have every reason to burn this letter without reading past this line, but I beg you to hear me out, if only this once. Cora and I have fallen on hard times since our banishment from Dravenlands. Every allied house has closed its doors to us, unwilling to risk the king's displeasure. We have nothing left, Illyra, nothing. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I ask only for a chance to speak with you, privately, away from the king's guards and the council's judgment. There are things you do not know about the circumstances of our family's deaths, things that might change how you understand what happened that night. Please, meet me at the old mill on the eastern road, 3 days from now, at dusk. Come alone, if you can find it in your heart to grant me even this small mercy. Your sister, whether you wish to claim me or not, Sabine." Illyra read the letter 3 times before setting it down with hands that trembled slightly, uncertain whether from anger or something more complicated, some tangled remnant of the love she had once felt for her sisters, before betrayal poisoned it entirely. She knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that she should show the letter to Cale immediately. Every instinct honed by months of assassination attempts and careful vigilance told her that anonymous letters requesting secret meetings, particularly from people who had already proven willing to sell her for profit, were far more likely to be traps than genuine pleas for reconciliation. And yet, a small, stubborn part of her wondered if there was truth buried somewhere within Sabine's words. Things you do not know about the circumstances of our family's debts. What could that mean? Had there been more to their desperation than simple greed? She hated that the question lingered in her mind at all, hated that some part of her still craved understanding from the sisters who had shown her none. She brought the letter to Cale that afternoon, watching his expression darken as he read it, his jaw tightening with barely contained anger. "This is almost certainly a trap," he said flatly, setting the letter down on his desk. "The timing alone is suspicious, coming so soon after the attack in the garden. Lord Voss may have found a way to use your sisters as pawns, knowing they might succeed where hired mercenaries have failed." "I know," Elira admitted. "I thought the same the moment I read it. But Cale, what if it isn't? What if there truly is something I don't know? Something that might explain." "Explain what, exactly?" Cale interrupted, though his tone remained gentle, despite the sharpness of the question. "Explain why they chose to sell their own sister, rather than seek honest help for their debts. Explain why they stood by silently while you were dragged from your bed in the middle of the night. Elira, I understand the pull of wanting answers, wanting some reason that might make sense of what was done to you. But I fear you are searching for closure in a place that will only offer you further harm. I'm not asking to go alone, unguarded," Elira said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the danger in what she was suggesting. "I'm asking whether there might be a way to learn the truth safely, with your guards nearby, without simply dismissing the possibility entirely." Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his instinct to refuse outright against his understanding of how much this unresolved question weighed on her. Finally he exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "If we do this," he said carefully, "it will be on my terms, entirely. Guards will surround the mill, unseen but close enough to respond instantly, should anything go wrong. I will accompany you myself, though I will remain concealed unless needed, so as not to frighten your sister into abandoning whatever plan, genuine or otherwise, she has arranged. Garrick will coordinate the guard positions personally. Do you agree to these terms?" "I agree," Elira said, relief and apprehension mingling within her in equal measure. 3 days later, as dusk began settling over the eastern road, Elira approached the old mill, with her heart hammering against her ribs, acutely aware of the concealed guards positioned throughout the surrounding trees, of Cale's presence somewhere close behind her, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. Sabine was already waiting when she arrived, standing near the mill's crumbling entrance, looking thinner and more worn than Elira had ever seen her. Gone was the elegant, calculating woman who had orchestrated Elira's betrayal months earlier. In her place stood someone who looked genuinely, visibly desperate. "You came," Sabine said, relief evident in her voice. "I wasn't certain you would." "I almost didn't," Elira admitted, keeping several careful paces of distance between them. "Where is Cora?" "She refused to come," Sabine said, a flicker of something bitter crossing her face. "She said reconciliation was pointless, that you would never listen regardless of what truth we offered. I told her I had to try, regardless." "Then tell me," Elira said, crossing her arms. "What is this truth you claim I don't know?" Sabine hesitated, glancing around nervously, and for a moment, genuine fear flickered across her features that made Elira's earlier suspicion waver slightly. "Our father," Sabine began slowly, "did not simply accumulate debts through poor management, as I once told you. He made an agreement, years before his death, with a man named Lord Voss." Elira's stomach dropped at the name, every instinct sharpening immediately. "Go on," she said carefully, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Father borrowed heavily from House Voss to maintain appearances after Mother's death," Sabine continued. "The debt grew far larger than any of us understood, until after his passing, when Lord Voss's agents came demanding repayment we could not possibly provide. They offered an alternative to the debt, Elira. They asked for you, specifically, by name, promising the debt would be entirely forgiven in exchange. They asked for me," Elira repeated slowly, horror dawning as the pieces began fitting into a far darker picture than she had ever imagined. "Not simply any daughter to sell for profit. They asked for me, specifically. Yes, Sabine said, her voice breaking slightly. I did not understand why at the time, only that refusing meant losing everything, being cast into poverty ourselves. I told myself it was a necessary evil, that you would find some tolerable life, regardless of the circumstances. I was wrong to believe that, and wrong to participate in it, and I am sorry, Alira, more than I can properly express. But I needed you to understand. This was never simply about greed. Lord Voss orchestrated this from the very beginning, wanting you specifically, for reasons I still do not fully understand. Alira's mind raced, connecting Sabine's revelation to everything Kale's council had discussed weeks earlier. Lord Voss's suspected involvement in the assassination attempts, his rivalry with Kale's claim to the Northern Territories. Had he somehow known, even before she carried the mark visibly, that she might become significant to Kale's power? Had this entire chain of betrayal been engineered from the very beginning, reaching back further than any of them had realized? Sabine, Alira said slowly, did Lord Voss ever say why he wanted me specifically? Did he give any reason at all? Only that you would be valuable, Sabine said, shaking her head. He never explained further, and I never asked, to my everlasting shame. I only wanted the debt gone, wanted our family's survival secured, and I told myself the cost was acceptable because you were the quietest, the least likely to fight back. She stopped herself, horrified at her own words, but the damage was already done. The ugly truth of her own sister's calculations laid bare between them. You believed I was weak, Alira said quietly, and so you decided I was expendable. I was wrong, Sabine said desperately. Alira, please. I know now how wrong I was. Seeing you today, hearing how you've faced everything since, you are stronger than Cora or I ever gave you credit for. I came here today not only to explain, but to warn you. Lord Voss will not stop, Alira. Whatever he wanted you for originally, he wants something from you still, badly enough to have hunted you across every step of this journey. Movement stirred in the trees beyond the mill, and Alira's pulse spiked before she recognized Kale emerging from the shadows, his expression thunderous, as he processed everything he had just overheard. Lord Voss requested you by name, Kale said, his voice dangerously quiet as he approached, before you had ever set foot in a slave market, before anyone outside your own family could have known the mark you carried. That's not possible, Alira said, though even as she spoke the denial, dread coiled tighter in her chest. I did not know I carried the mark myself, until you told me. How could he have known before either of us? Unless, Kale said slowly, working through the implications with visible tension, he did not know about the mark at all. Unless his interest in you predates the bond entirely, rooted in something else, something none of us have yet considered. Sabine looked between them, confusion and fear mingling on her face. I don't understand, she admitted. What else could he want with her, if not the bond you speak of? Kale's gold eyes met Alira's, something grim and urgent passing between them. I do not know, he admitted quietly, but I intend to find out, before Lord Voss has the opportunity to act on whatever plan he has been building since long before either of us understood what stood between us. The revelation hung heavy in the evening air, transforming what had begun as an uncertain reunion between estranged sisters into something far more dangerous. The discovery that the enemy circling Alira's life had been watching her, planning for her, long before fate had ever marked her wrist, for reasons that remained, for now, entirely and dangerously unknown. Thank you, Alira said finally, turning back to Sabine, surprising herself with the sincerity in her own voice, for telling me this, even though it must have cost you a great deal of pride to admit. I do not expect forgiveness, Sabine said quietly. I only hope, in some small way, this helps protect you from whatever comes next. Alira did not offer forgiveness that evening, uncertain whether she was ready to extend something so significant after everything that had been done to her. But as she walked away from the mill beside Kale, guards falling into formation around them as they made their way back toward the safety of Draven Hold, she found herself carrying, not resentment, but a strange, unexpected pity for the sister who had finally, belatedly, found the courage to tell the truth. Whatever waited ahead, whatever Lord Voss's true purpose had been from the very beginning, Alira understood now that the danger surrounding her ran far deeper than a simple territorial rivalry or an attempt to weaken Kale's standing among the council. Someone had wanted her, specifically, long before fate had ever bound her to a king, and uncovering the reason why would prove to be the most dangerous truth she had yet to face. The old records room beneath Draven Hold smelled of dust and aging parchment, and Alira had spent the better part of 3 days buried among its shelves, searching alongside Cale and Garrick for any mention of her family's name, any connection between House Hartwell and House Voss that might explain why Lord Voss had wanted her specifically, years before the fated bond had ever revealed itself. They found the answer on the evening of the 3rd day, in a record so old its edges crumbled slightly at Garrick's careful touch. "Here," Garrick said, his voice tight with discovery, sliding the aged document across the table toward Cale. "A marriage record, nearly 30 years old. Your mother, Alira, before she married your father." Alira leaned over the document, her breath catching as she read the faded ink. Her mother's name, listed beside a groom who had never been mentioned in any story she had heard growing up. Alden Voss, brother to the current Lord Voss. "My mother was betrothed to Lord Voss's brother," Alira said slowly, the pieces beginning to align into a picture darker and more tangled than she had imagined. "But she married my father instead." "The betrothal was broken," Garrick confirmed, scanning further down the document. "It appears your mother chose your father over the arranged match, a scandal significant enough that House Voss apparently never forgave the insult. Alden Voss died several years later, unmarried, and it seems the current Lord Voss has carried the grievance forward across the following decades." "He did not want me for the bond," Alira said, horror and understanding dawning together. "He wanted me because I am my mother's daughter. Because taking me, controlling me, using me as he saw fit. It was never about weakening Cale's power through the fated bond at all. Not originally. It began as revenge against my mother for choosing another man over his brother, decades before I was even born. And when he learned you carried the mark," Cale said grimly, working through the final piece of the puzzle, "he understood that his original plan for revenge had transformed into something with far greater strategic value. Removing you would satisfy an old grudge while simultaneously crippling my standing among the council. He has been patient, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to act." The revelation settled over the room like a physical weight, and Alira found herself gripping the edge of the table, steadying herself against the enormity of understanding just how far back the roots of her suffering truly extended. Decades of old bitterness, culminating in her sister's betrayal, in chains and an auction block, in months of assassination attempts that had never truly been random at all. "He will not stop," Alira said quietly, echoing Sabine's warning from the old mill days earlier. "Whatever plan he has been building, this discovery does not end it. If anything, it means he has had far longer to prepare than we realized." "Then we will not wait for him to act on his own timeline any longer," Cale said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Garrick, gather the council. I intend to present this evidence formally, and I intend to demand Lord Voss answer for his actions before every allied house of the Wolf Kingdoms." The council convened within 2 days, and this time, when Alira walked into the great hall beside Cale, she did so without the trembling uncertainty of the harvest gathering months earlier. She had faced her sister's betrayal, survived multiple assassination attempts, uncovered the truth of a decades-old grudge that had shaped the entire trajectory of her suffering. She would not stand silent while Lord Voss attempted to deny what evidence now made undeniable. Lord Voss arrived with his usual composed arrogance, clearly unaware of what awaited him, his expression only shifting to genuine alarm once Garrick began presenting the evidence they had uncovered: the marriage record, the mint marks connecting his coin to hired mercenaries, testimony gathered from the captured attackers who had finally, under careful questioning, revealed the true source of their payment. "This is fabrication," Lord Voss said sharply, though sweat had begun beating at his temple despite the coolness of the hall. "Coincidence and forged documents, nothing more. I demand to know what evidence truly connects me to these baseless accusations." "The mercenaries you hired have confirmed your involvement directly," Cale said coldly, stepping forward with an authority that seemed to fill the entire hall. "Your coin, your intermediaries, your decades-old grievance against Alira's mother, carried forward, into an attempt to destroy her daughter. The council has heard the evidence, Lord Voss. Do you truly intend to continue denying what stands so clearly before them?" Whispers swept through the assembled council, and Alira watched Lord Voss's composure crumble further with each passing moment, his allies among the gathered houses shifting uncomfortably, distancing themselves visibly from a man whose schemes had just been laid bare before the most powerful assembly in the Wolf Kingdoms. "You cannot prove intent," Lord Voss said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Even if the coin traces to my treasury, servants can be bribed, seals can be stolen." "Enough," a new voice interrupted, sharp and commanding, and Alira turned to see Lord Aldrich rising from his seat, the same man who had once challenged the authenticity of her mark at the harvest gathering. "I have heard sufficient evidence to satisfy my own doubts, Lord Voss, and I suspect I am not alone among this council. Your excuses grow thinner with each attempt at denial." One by one, other council members voiced similar sentiments, the tide of support Lord Voss had once commanded, eroding rapidly beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. Cornered and desperate, his composure finally shattered entirely. "She should have been mine," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of denial, his gaze fixing on Alira, with a hatred that made her skin crawl despite the guards surrounding her. "Her mother humiliated my family, chose a lesser house over ours, and this girl carries that same blood, that same betrayal. I would have seen the debt repaid one way or another, whether through the daughter's servitude or her death." "You would have destroyed an innocent woman," Cale said, his voice dropping to something dangerously quiet, "to satisfy a grudge that predates her own birth by decades. Your own brother's memory deserves better than the twisted vengeance you have carried in his name." Lord Voss's hand moved suddenly toward the blade at his hip, desperation overriding whatever remained of his rational judgment. But Cale moved faster, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion that left the entire hall gasping in shock. He disarmed Lord Voss with brutal efficiency, pinning him against the floor before the older man could offer any meaningful resistance, his gold eyes blazing with barely restrained fury. "You will face judgment for your crimes," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the hall, "before this full council, according to the laws that govern us all. Your attempt to draw a weapon in this sacred hall only confirms what evidence had already made clear." Guards moved quickly to secure Lord Voss, dragging him away as he continued shouting protests that no one in the hall seemed inclined to believe any longer. The confrontation that had built across months of careful investigation, of assassination attempts and anonymous letters and decades-old secrets finally unearthed, had reached its conclusion in a matter of minutes, leaving the great hall buzzing with stunned, relieved conversation. Alira stood frozen for a long moment, processing the sudden end of a threat that had shadowed nearly every day since her arrival at Draven Hold. Cale returned to her side immediately, his expression softening from the fierce authority he had shown moments earlier into something gentler, more concerned. "It's over," he said quietly, taking her hands in his. "Whatever comes next, Alira, this particular danger has finally been ended." "I can hardly believe it," she admitted, her voice unsteady with the release of months of accumulated tension. "After everything, my sisters, the assassination attempts, uncovering this entire history I never knew existed, it feels almost impossible that it could simply end here, in this hall, in a matter of minutes." "Not simply," Cale corrected gently. "It ended here because of months of your own courage, your willingness to face danger rather than hide from it, your insistence on understanding the truth, even when the truth proved far more complicated and painful than any of us anticipated. This victory belongs to you, as much as to me." The council formally sentenced Lord Voss, in the days that followed, stripping his house of its territorial claims and standing among the allied kingdoms, a punishment severe enough to ensure his particular brand of scheming vengeance would trouble Alira no further. Word of the confrontation spread quickly throughout the Wolf Kingdoms, and Alira found herself regarded with a new kind of respect among the council and the common people alike. No longer simply the king's fated mate, elevated by circumstances beyond her control, but a woman who had faced betrayal, danger, and decades of hidden malice with a strength that had ultimately proven undeniable. Sabine and Cora, upon hearing news of Lord Voss's downfall and the revelation of his role in orchestrating their family's original debts, sent no further letters. Alira learned through Margaret's careful inquiries that they had relocated to a distant province, attempting to rebuild some small, quiet life, far from the consequences of choices that had once seemed, to them, unavoidable. Alira did not seek reconciliation, though she found, with some surprise, that she no longer carried the same burning anger toward them either. What remained instead was something quieter, more resigned, an understanding that some relationships, once broken deeply enough, could not be fully repaired, only released. On a clear evening several weeks after Lord Voss's sentencing, Kale led Alira to the same garden where the assassin's arrow had once nearly claimed her life, now restored and blooming beneath careful tending, the overturned bench replaced, and the scattered stones swept away, as though the violence had never touched this peaceful place at all. "I have something to ask you," Kale said, and Alira noticed, with growing curiosity, a nervousness in his manner she had rarely witnessed from him before, not even in the face of assassins or hostile councils. "What is it?" she asked, though something in his expression made her heart begin to race with anticipation. "The fated bond marked us as belonging to each other," Kale said carefully, "before either of us had any choice in the matter. I have never doubted, since the moment I first saw you across that market square, that fate chose well in binding us together. But I find, after everything we have faced these past months, that I no longer wish for our bond to rest solely on the foundation of destiny. I want you to choose me, Alira, freely, in a way that owes nothing to fate and everything to your own heart." He knelt then, producing a simple silver ring that caught the last light of the setting sun, and Alira felt tears gathering in her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, as the full weight of everything they had survived together settled over her. "Alira Hartwell," Kale said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his gold eyes, "will you choose to remain at my side, not because fate demands it, but because you wish it for yourself?" "Yes," Alira said without hesitation, her voice thick with emotion as she knelt before him, taking his face gently between her hands. "Yes, Kale, I choose you. I have chosen you, I think, for longer than I allowed myself to admit." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he rose to pull her into his arms, the kiss that followed carried none of the uncertainty that had once colored their earliest days together, only the quiet, hard-won certainty of two people who had faced betrayal and danger, and decades of hidden vengeance, and had emerged from all of it not diminished, but strengthened, bound together by choice as much as by fate. Their wedding, held within the great hall of Dravenhold months later, drew representatives from every allied house of the Wolf Kingdoms, the same hall where Alira had once stood trembling before a skeptical council, now filled instead with genuine celebration. Margaret oversaw the preparations with fierce pride, Grace wept openly throughout the ceremony, and Edmund, ever faithful, stood guard at the hall's entrance one final time before finally allowing himself to relax into the role of honored guest rather than watchful protector. Alira stood beside Kale, as his queen, the mark on her wrist no longer a symbol of hidden danger, but a visible testament to a bond that had survived every attempt to break it. She thought, in the quiet moments between ceremony and celebration, of the frightened girl who had once been dragged from her bed in the dead of night, sold by the very sisters who should have protected her, chained upon an auction block in a city she had never wanted to see. That girl could never have imagined the woman she would become, or the life fate had been quietly weaving for her all along, hidden beneath layers of betrayal and danger that had once seemed insurmountable. She had been sold as a slave, discarded by those who should have valued her most, and yet here she stood, transformed not by fate alone, but by her own unwavering courage, into the most protected, most cherished woman in all the Wolf Kingdoms. As the celebration continued long into the night, Kale drew her close beneath a sky brilliant with stars, the same sky that had once watched over her darkest night of betrayal, now bearing witness to a joy she had never dared to hope for. "No regrets?" Kale asked softly, echoing the uncertainty that had once defined their earliest days together. "None," Alira answered, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely safe. "Everything I lost led me here, to you, to this life I never could have imagined for myself. I would not trade it for anything the world could offer." And beneath that same sky, surrounded by a kingdom that had come to love and respect her as fiercely as their king did, Alira understood at last that the cruelest betrayal of her life had, against every possible expectation, delivered her into the truest happiness she had ever known.